think we could really model this in a powerful way for the rest of the country and help other cities all around the country figure out how to reinvest in a community-driven way in the troubled areas in their cities so that we lift more people, help more people lift themselves really out of difficult circumstances. So that's where I want to go.
Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Devin Thorpe is a best-selling author, new media journalist, and champion of social good. His show, Superpowers for Good, has featured over 1,200 influential guests, and his articles and books, including Crowdfunding For Social Good, have reached millions of readers around the world. In this episode, we discuss his journey from the world of finance to social impact, beginning with his conversation with Bill Gates about the importance of patience.
For me, in a way, the highlight was talking to him about his superpower, and which is kind of has become the theme of my show. And I was really surprised. He brands himself as the impatient optimist. And yet when I asked him what his superpower was, he said patience. And he explained, he said at Microsoft, when we really wanted to do something big, I recognized it would take 5 years to do that. It was not, big things don't happen quickly. And he said, in the world of, kind of philanthropy and social impact, especially in healthcare, things can take much longer than that. Developing a new polio vaccine was kind of one of our themes. And he said that would take 10 years. And we did this recording in 2019, I think. And he talked about how the AIDS vaccine that was well underway at the time would have taken 25 years. After our conversation, the vaccine was rejected. It did not get implemented. And so here we are now 30 years in since the development of a vaccine for AIDS has started, and we still don't have it. So it's these things take time. And it's great to have somebody that has a little bit of patience and is willing to put the money behind it to make a difference. And I think because of that, he will play a really outsized impact in eradicating polio. Because then he started working on a new vaccine in about 2010. And in 2010, I know this sounds crazy kind of in hindsight, but everyone in the polio eradication community would have said, we've got this. We're going to have polio eradicated within 3 to 5 years. We are so close. The official theme of Rotary on talking about polio eradication was, we're this close. And, it's now 14, 15 years later, and we're still haven't done it. But he started working on a vaccine he knew would take a decade to create. And what his vaccine does different is that it never mutates into a live virus. And the Sabin vaccine, the oral drops that are most commonly used, do. So about 1 out of every 2 million doses leaves a child with the contagion of a genuine case of polio. So it's very rare, but when you're administering 1 billion or more doses per year, you're talking about hundreds of cases of people getting a transmittable case of polio. Now, generally speaking, that doesn't impact the child that got the vaccine. Very, 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 very. I've heard some people say it never happens. I think it's just extraordinarily rare because there's only about a 1 in 200 chance that someone with polio is left with any paralysis. It's a weird disease in that way. Very different from smallpox, for instance, which we got rid of precisely because if you had smallpox, everybody knew it. If you've got polio and it just gives you flu symptoms or cold symptoms or no symptoms, you can just walk around and give it to people and nobody knows. And so that's what really happens most of the time with polio. So it's really hard to get pinned down. Anyway, I've talked too much about this, but I get excited. I loved, it was a really exciting thing to talk to Bill Gates about his patience and how vitally important that was, and his decision to pull the trigger on that will likely change the course of polio eradication, because here we are in 2024. And when there is an outbreak of the circulating vaccine-derived polio. They use the novel, they call it the novel. It really should be called the Gates vaccine, because that's how they are stamping that out, and it really is helping.
There's a lot to unpack in that beyond Bill Gates. I mean, we could talk about people's interaction with, of course, vaccines and what's happened, not just in the United States with resistance to the concept of vaccines, but globally, where within certain environments, it's become dangerous for people to be engaged in distribution of vaccines. And it goes beyond the issue of live virus or mRNA and all these other things. It's just more, it's almost a political thing.
Yeah.
But would be wonderful and fun to talk about that. I also want to dig into this idea about patience, because you're talking about Bill Gates in that context and saying that he's on one hand impatient, and that's probably what leads him to pursue things doggedly. But on the other hand, that's his superpower, is patience. I'm wondering if you see that as a consistent trait for others that you've interviewed, because you work with a lot of NGO people. They deal with a lot of big problems. They aren't all at the scale of polio, but they're huge. And is patience a virtue in those pursuits?
You know, I think it is. And I think in some ways it is, there is a tendency for us to use a lot of different labels for a cluster of related attributes. And I've been thinking about writing a follow-up to my book, Superpowers for Good, that would drill down on, I think, the three kind of essential superpowers that we should all try to cultivate if we have a social impact mindset. But one of those clusters is around what is more commonly called resilience, grit, perseverance, persistence. But patience would be part of that cluster, right? Where part of what we have to do is to recognize we cannot go from here to where we want to go in a straight line. As much as we want to, it's not going to happen. And if that's not going to happen, then how do we cope with the troubling, difficult days? And there will be those days. How do we cope with that, right? And one aspect is patience, right? And when I was researching patience for my book, I spent some time about working on this, and I was stunned by what I found. And I realized patience, or the lack of patience, is simply a conscious recognition that our expectations haven't been met, right? And that's whether we are being impatient with a child's behavior, or whether we are being impatient with the hamburgers at McDonald's or something. And you know, the great analogy that I identified in this context is you'll see people, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but for years, right, when the new iPhone came out, people would camp out outside the Apple store for days to be the first one to get an iPhone. And that activity, waiting, was exactly the same activity that someone engages in when they're at McDonald's or Burger King waiting for a burger. And after about 4 minutes, they start to get really impatient, because their sense is that burger should be out in about 4, maybe 5 minutes. You get to 10 and holy cow, you get steam coming out of your ears. You're turning red. You want to talk to the manager. It's the same exact activity that same person might have engaged in. In fact, you could imagine the guy saying, hold my spot in line here at the Apple store while I go to McDonald's, waiting 2 days for the iPhone, waiting 10 minutes for the burger. The difference is the expectation, right? And the expectation is entirely conscious. And if that's entirely conscious, then we can change it, right?
So first of all, what's feeding that impatience then, based on what you've seen? And then how do we change it?
Yeah, it's incorrect expectations, right? Our expectation for a child's behavior, our expectation for how easy this project is going to be. I think of, my DIY projects here at the house, right? If I think, I can do this in 15 minutes and it takes an hour, I get really upset and there are words said and my wife wants to leave the house. If I say to myself, this is going to be a big project, I'm going to allocate the entire afternoon to this project, and it takes 2 hours, I'm thrilled because I had allocated 4, right? So it's those expectations are entirely our choice. And so I have learned, I'm learning. I try to do this consciously, right? When I feel myself getting impatient, say, okay, I got to reset. I got to reset the expectation around this process. It isn't going to be a day, an hour, 15 minutes, whatever it was that I was expecting. We're going to reset. And it does help, right? It does help. Sometimes you got to take a step back, go get a soda. But yeah, resetting the expectations is entirely within our control. And then we can become a little more Bill Gates-ish.
So are you by nature a patient or an impatient person? Are you the Bill Gates who he purports to be, or the one who practices what he says is a superpower?
Yeah. I'm learning. I've always wanted to be patient, and I've never felt like I was. And this interview with Bill gave me the opportunity to really think about it in a new way. And I began to appreciate, okay, yeah, that is entirely within my control. I've got to develop new habits. With a little bit of work, I can be much more patient.
It's funny because if you're interviewing people, which you do so much of, and you're saying in your mind anyway, I have 22 or 25 minutes, something like that, then there's a certain amount of not only discipline to that, but a little bit of impatience, because you gotta get to the answers you're looking for, or at least to be able to complete the time together. So yeah. Has that fed your ability then to control those immodest expectations?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, I had a related experience doing my show with, I had Steve Young, the San Francisco quarterback, won a couple of Super Bowls. I had him on my show. He used to do, I don't know if he still does, he used to do a Sunday morning ESPN show talking about football during the football season. But there was a time when he was genuinely famous. But Steve came on the show, and things were not going well at all. And it wasn't, his people hadn't prepared him well, right? And so he thought it was going to be a phone call. My show was a video show. He needed to be connected into the internet. He was in his car. He couldn't connect into the internet. This is a decade ago, before some of the technologies that are ubiquitous now were. And so he didn't have any way to do it. And so I ended up taking my Steve Young autographed football, and I put it right next to my microphone and put the phone on the football next to the microphone. And we did the interview that way. Of course, during the interview, I knocked the phone off the football, so there's a big clunk in the middle of the interview. It was horrible. But through all of it, he was so classy, he was so patient. He was so kind. He was so respectful. And I realized that sometimes when my guests were not well prepared, when they had not followed instruction, had not come ready in the way that I wanted and expected, I was impatient with them. And boy, when Steve Young was so kind to me, I remember that was probably, if I had to say, what is the single most life-changing interview, was that this football player taught me about kindness in such a profoundly powerful way. I had an opportunity to run into him a year or two later at an event, and told him, how much I appreciated that. He didn't remember me, but I told him that it had really been a life-changing conversation for me, and I still think of it that way. I still try to emulate that Steve Young moment.
The things we learn are so funny as we move through life, and some of them are ones that we're intentional about. Other times it just happens, and then we discover this, and then we lean into it. It sounds like that's a little bit what you've done, but if you peel this way back and your origin story, which I don't think many people have heard, I wonder what traits were there that led you to where you are. So I mean, I can go through a biography, but it's better if you share some of that. So you're originally from Utah, correct? From Salt Lake?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and Salt Lake City is a city that's unique to itself, I would say. So is Utah a unique place, a beautiful place with very unique cultures within it. And you were there and did the thing that people do, I guess, when they're growing up as students. And then you went into finance or actually studied finance, and then went to politics, and et cetera, et cetera. But Who was the Devin Thorpe way back when? So when you were there growing up, what was in your mind about where you might go, who you might be?
I really had, as I've reflected on this, I began to appreciate, probably 15 years ago, that my life had been defined by an experience I had as an 11-year-old. And in 1976, I was 11, and there was a dam in southern Idaho, southeastern Idaho, called the Teton Dam. It was brand new. And the first time they filled the reservoir, the dam failed. It had been poorly engineered. And it was not that they built the dam wrong, they built it in the wrong place. The bedrock was the problem. In any case, the flood killed about a dozen people, left 80% of the structures in the town of Rexburg, Idaho, damaged or destroyed. And so communities from all around the West kind of descended on Rexburg that summer to try and help clean the muck and mud out of basements. And toward the end of the summer, my dad said, our community is going to go up, our church community. Do you want to go? And, I thought digging muck and mud out of a basement sounded like a good time. I was 11. So I said, sure. And we went. I was really excited. I remember we went on buses up to Rexburg from Salt Lake, and that was about a 4-hour trip. So we left about 2:00 in the morning, and so we could arrive at dawn, and then we just worked all day. I remember we had donuts when we got off the bus, and we worked all day, and then we got back on the buses that night. I remember, I don't think I slept at all on the way up. I passed out the minute I got on the bus coming home. Don't remember anything after that. But, I went back to Rexburg a few years ago, and I was looking around, and I could not find the statue that they had erected in my honor. I was really kind of disappointed. Of course, as a kid, I really thought I'd made a big difference, right? I really thought that I had changed the world. What had really happened is I had been changed. But, as an adult, I look back and recognize I was probably making no difference whatsoever. That I was probably in the way as often as I was helpful, and unproductive as much as I was there. But I was part of the team, and I got to see and participate in that, helping other people. And so I remember very consciously deciding I would never miss an opportunity to do that, to help other people. Now, I did. I missed a lot of opportunities to serve other people, but as I grew up toward adulthood, I very consciously planned 2 careers. A first career focused on making money, and a second career that would be focused on what I now call social impact, doing good, helping people. And so I launched into that career in my mid-40s, and I haven't regretted it for a minute. I love what I do, trying to help people. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I succeed.
When I talk to people about this, and I ask, and I dig deeper, like digging through the mud, I'll often discover there's somebody who inspired something like that. In this case, it sounds like it was both your father saying something, perhaps your mother too, I don't know, but then also the church, because you said a whole bunch of buses went up there. And I was born in 1962. I don't remember that incident of that dam failure. So obviously my community, or at least I, wasn't aware of this. Yours was. So how important was both the church and your family in terms of setting that compass for you so you could revisit it in your 40s?
Yeah. It's no question that my family and the church are foundational in that, and I'm grateful for that tremendous influence. I still participate actively in the church, and it's a very important part of my life. I'm grateful for it. So yeah, it was important. Family is important. I think our relationships with our parents, if we're being honest, they're complicated. For most of us, right? And I learned some wonderful things from my parents. They were both, in their own fairly different ways, very community minded, wanted to help people. My dad was he's a lot like me. I'm a lot like my dad in that I tend to be like the idea of helping people sometimes more than helping people. sometimes helping people is real work. Sometimes they don't appreciate it. Sometimes, there are all kinds of real world problems. And I'm grateful for some of the lessons I've learned from people like Steve Young and Bill Gates that have helped me to be a little more patient and a little more kind in a real day-to-day basis. I'm still learning. Certainly not perfect. I'm learning.
There's another phase in this, because I know we're kind of skipping around, which is that you worked on the Hill and specifically the Senate, I guess, Banking Committee.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
How in the world did that happen? And that must have been an influence on you because later you ran for office. So because some people who haven't experienced there, that's their life then. And other people, they run away and they never want to go back.
Yeah.
For you, again, you've continued to experience different ways of having impact. So first of all, how in the world did you find your way to Capitol Hill and that committee?
Yeah, the senator from Utah was the ranking minority member of the committee. And so he had a whole staff of people, mostly from Utah, that worked for him there. And the University of Utah placed a few interns there every semester. And so I started out as an intern there. And I had an interesting experience. I had gone very much with the expectation that I would use that semester to find a job in DC and that I would spend a couple of years in DC before I went back to grad school. And one day I, slipped out for an interview and came back. And the boss was just livid, right, that I had slipped out for an interview. So you can't do that. And I said, well, now wait a minute. I've come here to spend 6 months working almost for free, and you're telling me I'm not allowed to slip out for a few hours to get a job so that when I'm done with this commitment, I can land on my feet. He said, that is correct. You are not allowed. And but what worked out is that when the semester was over, they said, well, would you like to stay for a while? And I think part of, they were motivated by two things. I wasn't entirely incompetent, but they also felt bad about this exchange that had happened, right? That I had come with the expectation that I could find a job while I was doing the internship so that when the internship was done, I could move on to have employment. And they had kiboshed that. So they felt guilty about that. And so they let me stay on. And that went, it was kind of a 6-week extension followed by a 6-week extension for several months. And then they finally said, listen, let's make this permanent and you can stay. And so I ended up staying a total of 2 years. And I learned a ton. I mean, you can imagine, I had some neat, wonderful experience. I was there. The senator was in the middle of a fairly controversial nomination fight for a regulator that had to have a Senate confirmation. And I staffed him on this confirmation. Now, it was really weird in that the guy that we nominated was incompetent. He was an obvious wrong choice. And yet my senator was advocating for him. So I was staffing him. I did a lot of the grunt work on this behind the scenes, writing up documents. This was not, the Secretary of the Treasury, right? This is 2 or 3 levels below the Secretary of the Treasury. But they allocated about 6 hours of floor debate on the Senate floor. And I got to go staff the senator for the 6 hours. Now, so I had binders and all the information. This is the olden days, right? So it's all on paper, but I had just stacks of information. And I went down, I sat next to the senator right on the Senate floor, or near, I guess I was kind of in. Anyway, there was never any debate. After 6 hours, they took a vote and he got confirmed. But it was fascinating experience to see all of this. But, so I had a couple of experiences working for the Republicans at that time that gave me my first clues that my Republican values might not align with some of my other values. And I remember that there was another intern on the staff that had gone to Cornell, and he worked for us on the Republican side for his internship. And then he got another job there in the Senate staffing a Democrat. And I was like, you defected, what's the deal? And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, I just thought it would be fun to be on the side of the angels for a while. And, this was a young man I kind of liked and respected and admired. And he was defecting from the truth, right? He was betraying our loyalties, and it kind of freaked me out. But so, in a way, working for the Republicans in the Senate began a long, slow journey to becoming a fairly passionate liberal, passionate enough that in 2020 I ran for Congress in an almost, frankly, an unwinnable race. But I ran for Congress, got the Democratic nomination, and ran for Congress in Utah's 3rd district, one of the most conservative districts in the country, and shockingly did not win that race.
So again, I know we're bouncing around over the years, but you're living now in California, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
So to run in Utah, did that mean that you had to go back and plant your feet in the soil again and do that, or were you living there at the time?
I was still living in Utah.
Okay.
I left Utah about 18 months after the election, or 2 years after the election, lived in Florida for 18 months, and then moved a year ago here to California. And, there are things to love everywhere, we're finding. I miss Florida a lot more than I thought I would when we left. Good riddance, but I really miss it.
But why leave Utah? Because you had definitely made a staked a claim to try and turn a seat winnable that was virtually unwinnable. That's commitment.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of things that go into that. The conscious excuse for that move was that we had reached a point where we no longer ever took any advantage of Utah's winters, right? We were not skiers, and my wife has some disabilities, and so the snow and ice just was miserable for her. So it was 6 months every year of really, kind of an isolation where she couldn't get out of the house. So we said, let's go somewhere warm. And so that's why Florida and California. Florida, it turns out, is a very long distance from Utah and California, where all of our family and friends are. And it was hard to convince anybody to come visit us. So we decided to move back to the West Coast. So we're here in California, closer to family.
Now, that political journey, that second stage of the political journey was, I guess, after you'd done a lot already in finance. You'd owned a company, and I believe sold that company. You'd been a senior officer, a couple of others, all in this financial realm, and then went on this other journey. But you've talked about often in your public speaking anyway, and I'm sure in your books, about how those two things can and should work together, that businesses can be, you don't use these words, but good social actors. And there's a benefit to the community, of course, but also to the businesses. So was that transition a relatively easy one for you? Were you already on that path by the time that you were running, for example?
Well, yes. What really got me started on that was writing some books about using money for good. And in that context, a friend of mine connected me with the opportunity to write as a contributor for Forbes. And I began with the assignment to cover social entrepreneurship and impact investing, which in some ways, if I were being honest, I'd have to admit I didn't know much about. Since, I've been writing about these activities now for a dozen years, I like to think I'm an expert on these topics now, but it did allow me to sort of leverage my understanding of capital markets. I had run an investment banking firm that I had started myself and owned. I had, as you mentioned, I'd been an officer in some corporations of some scale and international reach. And so, I was able to bring all of this together in a way where I was able to align my interest in social impact, doing good, with my pedigree, if you will, in finance. And I'm really grateful for that. I focus a lot of my energy now on what I call impact crowdfunding, this area where we invest, not donate, but invest in companies that are doing good or that are run by disadvantaged, or at least traditionally disadvantaged founders. Women and minorities have a really tough time accessing capital, and crowdfunding is a way where they are getting a larger share of the pie and succeeding nicely. And I love to advocate for that. And it's a way for all of us to align our investments with our social impact missions, right? In the nonprofit world, we all bring a passion for doing good. And the most sophisticated nonprofits that are setting up, retirement plans are using ESG tools to help screen those investments. But what that means is, there are people arguing about whether Tesla qualifies because they make electric cars that don't pollute, but they have poor corporate governance. They're run by a very strong-willed individual who, is not, he's infamous for the way he treats his people, right? And so, here's the thing. When you make an investment or a fund you invest in invests in Tesla, the money doesn't go to Tesla. The money goes to BlackRock or whoever else happens to be selling shares that day, right? You're not putting your money in Tesla. We often say that, right? But it is impossible, except in an IPO, and most of us have trouble getting access to IPO shares, to put money into a company, right? What you're doing is you're putting money into BlackRock or whoever else happens to be selling shares. Typically, they know more about what's going on than we do. So we're buying when someone smarter is selling, not always a good thing. So the stock market is kind of rigged against us, A, and B, we really can't have any impact with our money in the stock market, even if we do a great job of aligning our investment portfolio there with our social values, right? And so I really want to encourage people to look seriously at investment crowdfunding, because there's this whole arena now where you can go put money in a Black female founder who's running a food truck or some other small business and is borrowing money. And she's borrowing money at a rate that's comparable to the return you'd get in the stock market. And she's desperate to get that cash, right? So she's thrilled when you lend it to her and you get the same return you'd get, maybe better, than you get in the stock market. Why wouldn't we do that all day long, right?
And so that's relatively recent that people could even do that, right? Because historically, you had to be an accredited investor, you had to have so much in net worth and so much in income. That's really opened up, I guess, in just the last few years.
Yes, it really has. It's dramatic. It's changed. And so right now, this minute, there are about 400 or 500 offerings available in the country, which means that there's probably one that's not far from you, where you live, right? That's raising capital. You might even be able to drive by the business and see it. But there are people doing businesses in really innovative ways that are supporting all kinds of philanthropic initiatives. In fact, sometimes nonprofits are sponsors of these offerings. I invested in one that is a solar installation to serve a low-income community that was managed by a nonprofit. So the nonprofit's not taking cash out of this, but there is a financed portion of the solar project. And there are all kinds of really high-impact, serve the community kinds of things, as well as opportunities to back diverse founders who aren't often, able to get financing. And now there's this new way. And so I really like to encourage people who look like the two of us, right, to really be thoughtful about using a lens that says, I'm going to start looking for opportunities to invest in people who don't look like me, right? And then when we start to do that, very quickly we begin to say, oh, when I look through that lens as a starting place, it's easy to find people who are doing things, they're super competent, right? Super well educated or have deep experience in the thing that they're doing. They've got a great business. Maybe it's been profitable for 3 years and they're borrowing money at a rate that I want to lend at. I mean, there are all kinds of opportunities.
And as you're pointing out, this is an investment. So it's not competitive with philanthropy. I mean, you use that wording here as we're thinking about it, but people can give, and then people can also invest in these businesses.
We all do both, don't we? Right? We all need to be saving for retirement. There's going to come a point in our lives, all of us, when we can no longer work. Even if we love what we do, there will come a point when we have to live off our money. And Social Security provides a very low standard of living, right? It's, thank heaven, it's there. But none of us want to live on that exclusively. So we've got to save some money.
So let me ask you about this from another perspective, which is that as people think about crowdfunding, I know that there's been a lot of desperation for those funds. I just received another thing today, again, from, I think it was a gentleman in Nigeria or something, looking for a way to raise some funds for his charitable organization. And one of the difficulties has been they don't have social ambassadors to promote the cause. They don't have a file of names they can reach out to, all the things. So a couple questions. On the for-profit side or impact investing, how successful is crowdfunding, and how does that compare to crowdfunding for charitable purposes, for not-for-profit organizations? Is it successful?
I think the total amount of money flowing to nonprofits is greater still than the amount of money being invested via crowdfunding, including all the money going to crowdfunding, including some of which you and I would not describe as having any social impact. But it's working, right? We're in early days, and some of us who are practitioners are frustrated a little bit, right? We're deploying our patience, trying to manage that because it's not growing as fast as we would like. We're not seeing the progress we would like to see because the potential is so dramatic, right? This has the potential to be genuinely an economic driver that is unparalleled, right? It can be genuinely that important, right? To change the way our economy works so that you are getting your dry cleaning done at a shop that you have an ownership interest in. You're eating lunch at a shop that you have an ownership in it. You're buying groceries from a little shop down the street that you have an ownership interest in. That changes the game dramatically. And that economy could emerge from this. And there are people who are having some success in executing on this. And I'm kind of viewing my role as supporting entrepreneurs primarily by encouraging investors. So I recently wrote a book called How to Make Money with Impact Crowdfunding, and it's a guide for investors on how to do this, starting at the very beginning, the most basics, because it is scary to do this the first time. I remember I wrote about this stuff for years before I did it, even after it became legal. I said, that's somebody else's job. I'll write about it. Somebody else will do it. And then finally I did it. I said, this is kind of fun. It's actually kind of cool, right? And so now I've made dozens and dozens of investments. I love it.
So maybe a last question on the crowdfunding front is whether or not supporting businesses through crowdfunding, especially people who, as you said, don't necessarily look like you and me, businesses that have less access to financing but have great potential for their communities and maybe great social impact as well, does that potentially lessen the need for philanthropy in those communities as a result? So if we're actually investing in these businesses, does that mean that there might be less need for organizations to be addressing problems in the first place?
Well, yes, but I don't want anybody to get nervous that we're going to put, the philanthropy industry out of business. Let's be clear. There's probably not a nonprofit in this country that doesn't have a demand for services that exceeds its capacity to give it, right? So I want folks to be thinking about how this can right the ship, bring balance to that chaos over the long haul, right? You got to deploy some patience. But I look at the community where I live in Stockton, and I love Stockton. I just got to tell you, my wife and I both just love this town. It is arguably the most diverse city in the country. It's a white minority community. It's mostly a working class community. And so the interactions you have with people are folks, these are people with no pretense, right? There are a few Stanford grads kicking around, but this is not a group of Ivy Leaguers who are trying to impress one another. These are folks who are union members and hardworking people. And it's just we've just loved this community, but there are some real challenges and some real blighted neighborhoods. And I look at these and I see, we could invest in that business and in that business. And in the middle of these blighted neighborhoods, you see McDonald's and you realize that McDonald's isn't helping at all, right? Most of the profits are leaving town. I don't know where they're going, but they either go to the corporation or to a franchise owner that's not in town. The wages paid are miserable. And so, there's no prosperity in the neighborhood around it. Whereas you see neighborhoods where you see robust investment and it completely changes. And I've seen communities where that happens, where the community begins to really invest in the community in a way that's genuinely local. It completely changes the game. I think about the Tulsa massacre that has finally risen to where white people are more aware of it. Maybe you've always been aware of it, but it hit my radar in the last 5 or 10 years. And what was going on that led to that was dramatic prosperity in that community. That's why the white folks felt threatened and executed that community, because they were so prosperous. But they had developed a very deliberate pattern of investing in one another and doing business with each other. So $1 that went into that community was recycled on the order by academic studies over 100 times. A dollar that goes into a McDonald's, it's out of town so fast, you can't even see it.
I never would have thought to ask you this until you said that, but there's so much polarization. Everybody talks about it all the time, but we don't really dig into it. And you've talked about your own journey and how when the politics with your values didn't completely align, you made your own changes politically and committed to those. You just described the Tulsa race massacre and one of the impetuses for that terrible violence on Black Wall Street among their neighbors who were less affluent in the white community. Today, if we do things to right the ship, if we are investing more in local businesses and not-for-profits through our charity to help ensure that there's some equity and not just a little bit more money here and there, they're a handout, but people can really rise. How might that influence this polarization, both negatively and positively? How can we ensure that the kinds of things that you've been working on and that nonprofits work on every day don't feed the negative, but in fact help to lift the positive, to bring us closer together?
Yeah, I think the key there is to be deliberate, right? And it reminds me of the role of nonprofits, right? And nonprofits can prioritize a social mission in a way that a for-profit business can't, and help to bring a little bit of discipline, a little bit of extra intentionality to community investment program, right? So that you can, my vision for this, there's a nonprofit called the National Coalition for Community Capital, and they've developed a legal structure called the Diversified Community Investment Fund. And that structure allows for capital to be raised under regulation crowdfunding that can then be invested via regulation crowdfunding for the benefit of other people in the community. And of course, nonprofits can, and I would argue should, play a critical role in the formation of those funds and in the allocation of the capital. And it can really be a vital difference maker. I envision a fund that has a few $1 million, but that catalyzes investments of 5 or 10 times that amount raised through crowdfunding from other members of the community along with the fund, right? And you begin to see the catalyst that little fund could provide to a community that builds that kind of economic local community in a more maybe inclusive way, potentially, like the Black Wall Street that existed there in Tulsa. But that real emphasis on a local, prosperous economy can really lift the boats in a community and make a huge difference.
So it's
but
not
everybody has to be able to participate.
It's investing locally. Yeah.
So
you've done a lot of books. You've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. What's really moving you now? I mean, you talked about this in terms of the crowdfunding books, but What remains to be done? What's the hole that you haven't filled?
Yeah, I think it's where we were just kind of talking, right? It's this idea of finding a way to build a fund, right? That maybe I'm participating in a critical way in that could help Stockton, right? And I want that to serve not only as a tool for Stockton, which I see as having just so much potential, but also as a model for other challenged cities. I call Stockton a town. We live near the center of town, and it feels very small to me compared to Jacksonville, where we lived most recently. But it's a city of 300,000 people or something. It's a pretty big town. And I think we could really model this in a powerful way for the rest of the country and help other cities all around the country figure out how to reinvest in a community-driven way in the troubled areas in their cities so that we lift more people, help more people lift themselves really out of difficult circumstances. So that's where I want to go.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Devin Thorpe, you can find him online at devinthorpe.com and catch episodes of his podcast at superpowersforgood.com. That's superpowers, the number 4, good.com. Our thanks to our sponsor, DonorSearch, the world leader in fundraising intelligence solutions, and our producer, Jack Frost. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, the DonorSearch YouTube channel, or wherever you like to listen, and consider giving us a like and a positive review so others can find us as well. Please check out our live webinars and webcasts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and come back next week for another interview with a leader in the world of social good. Until then, this is Jay Frost. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.